Okay, so for the cost centers, as we just discussed, that the cost centers can be either engineered cost centers or the discretionary cost centers. So just to outline the main difference between the two, the engineered cost centers are those departments whose activity, whose inputs, whose resource requirements can be linked with the output generated by some other cost center, some other revenue center, some other profit center, right? So for example, the production department we initially discussed, that is a sort of engineered cost center because we know how much resources we need for production based on the production targets, based on the sales that will be made by the sales department or the targets given to us by the production planning department. So this is the kind of engineered cost center. On the other hand, the discretionary cost center is such that we cannot establish this link with the output, accounts department, HR department. So these are the type of cost centers, right, for which we cannot have an optimum amount of resources which we can work out based on the number of units we are going to sell or things like that. So of course, we label them discretionary because there is a discretion, right? This discretion can be held with the board of directors, it can be held with the chief executive officer, or it can be held with the particular manager of the department. So when we say it is a cost discretion cost center, it means we say that the manager is actually responsible to control the expenses. So to some extent, the authority is actually delegated to the manager of that particular department. So over the cost centers, we see that the resources, the inputs can be measured in monetary terms, but the output cannot be measured in monetary terms, right? So these are the engineer ones and these are the discretionary ones. And there are few responsibility centers in which all cost items are either engineered or discretionary, right? So of course, this distinction is actually a bit illusionary because there are overlaps. So for example, there is always a certain minimum amount of resource requirement for the accounts department, for the HR department, for say a given level of output. So none of the all the expenses are engineered. Even in the engineered cost centers, not all the expenses are actually proportional to the output. There is always a certain discretionary sort of expenses which the manager can decide whether to incur that expense or not, whether to have more indirect labor. For example, the direct labor is something which which exactly is an expense, is a resource which you need according to the output requirement. For the indirect labor, for example, the sweepers, for example, you make the cleaning once a day or twice a day or thrice a day in the production department, right? It eventually is a discretionary thing. So this means that these terms, this vocabulary is the relative vocabulary. So when there is a department, when there is a business unit for which there are more expenses related to the output of other departments, output given by the organization, other units, then that's an engineered cost center. And if there are less number of fixed expenses, which are fixed means the proportionate expenses related to the output, then that's a sort of a engineered discretionary cost centers. So the term fixed and variable is not relevant here yet. Variable is relevant here, right? So variable means variable with respect to the output. So in a department where more of the expenses are variable with respect to the output of another department, right? Output required by sales, revenue required by sales department, then that's a sort of a cost center. But we don't need to confuse into fixed and revenue. So that's a different class of fixed and variable. That's a different classification over here we are concerned with. Whether these expenses, there is an independent authority to either incur these expenses or not, or they are to be incurred based on certain decisions made at some other level. That's the distinction between the engineered and the discretionary cost centers. So for the engineered cost centers, their inputs can be measured in monetary terms. So this is the generic for every cost center. Their output can be measured in physical terms or abstract service measures. So we can measure the output, how much direct labor hours are actually worked in the production department, how much direct material consumed is actually put into the finished goods, right? How much units of finished goods, for example, have been produced, right? So the direct labor hours are input, the raw material is input, but we can measure the output, how many units of finished goods have been produced. So the optimum monetary amount of input required to produce 1 unit of output can be determined. So this is the main thing that we discussed in the last video as well, so that there can be a relationship established between the output, which is either measured in physical terms or abstract terms if it is a service that we have taken care of this much amount of patients in the last month. So for this much amount of patients, how much nurse hours we require, how much doctor hour we require, right? In a hospital, for example. So this relationship can be established. And over here, now for the performance evaluation, the difference between the theoretical and the actual cost is measured to assess the performance of the expense center. So now a sort of a flexible budget. So whatever output we have produced, how much expenses should we have incurred for this output based on the budget? That's a flexible budget, right? So all the variance analysis that we did are actually relevant here. So for example, for the engineer cost center, production cost center, we have the direct material variances, we have the direct labor variances, right? So how much how much expense, how much resources should be allocated for this much amount of output that we have produced, which is the flexible budget, and how much actually we have done. And the difference of the two is actually the variance, and on the basis of which the performance evaluation of the department and the concerned manager is to be done. So usually have other important tasks not measured by expense only. For example, if meeting the financial target is the only thing, then of course we can compromise the quality, we can compromise the training and development, which cannot be translated into output. So, but in the long run, it has an impact. So this means that for these kind of cost centers, even though the variance analysis, the targets, and the difference of the targets, and the flexible budget and the actual budget actual is something which should be taken as the benchmark, which should be taken as a criteria, KPIs for performance evaluation, but not only that, we need to take care, we need to have certain bounds that we should not compromise quality. So how many inspection, how many units have been rejected in inspection, for example, right? So this can also be one criteria. Training and development, so in terms of how many staff have been trained, and again training and development can also be reflected, that whether the direct labor is making some mistakes and doing more wastage, or they are incurring more labor hours, for example. So that will actually show not the training and development efficiency for the current period, it will show the training and efficiency maybe for the previous periods, right? So the training and development, maybe the control can be for the current period can be whether you spend this much amount of training budget. So over here, saving the money is not a good thing in training and development. It is rather spending the money is the good thing, right? Provided that you have also tagged the right training programs for your labor and things like that. So this means that variance analysis actually focuses on how much money you have saved. But for certain expenses like training and development, the variance analysis should not be taken as the KPI. It should be treated separately. So for the discretionary expense centers, output cannot be measured in monetary terms, right? So here we cannot establish either the monetary or the physical output, how much output account department is producing, how much output HR department is producing. Maybe number of hirings, again not a good measure. Maybe number of salaries processed, not a good measure, right? So discretionary does not imply haphazard management's judgment, right? So it has to be some organized framework for which we use the word discretionary. So it reflects management's decision regarding certain policies. So management's view as to discretionary is subject to change, right? So this is a subjective term, discretionary. To what extent you give discretionary power to your manager, right? So it is a very subjective, and therefore there is no one single rule for the performance evaluation of discretionary cost centers, right? So for a accounts department, for example, the management may fix that, okay, you may have only two more hirings in the next period, right? So two more hirings, no discretionary with the manager whether he can hire more or he can probably he can hire less, but he cannot hire more. You can have three more computers, three more printers you can buy in the next period, right? So these are the kind, although they are kind of discretionary expenses, but the management can put some limit, the top management, which eventually restrict the discretionary power of the managers. So now these expenses comparatively are insulated from the short-term fluctuations. So whether your production is more or production is less, whether your sales are more or sales are less, your accounts department budget, your labor HR department budget will not get affected. And the important thing for the performance evaluation is this point that living within the budget does not necessarily indicate efficient performance. So if I did not invest in training and development, if HR department did not introduce some orientation program and saved money. It didn't did more training programs and saved money. Accounts department didn't hire good quality resources and saved money. They are not actually always signs of good performance, right? So here we must not do variance analysis, budget versus actual, right? So because here it's just the other way around. The financial control in discretion express center is quite different. So what's the control? It is primarily exercised at the planning stage before the expenses are incurred. So long as the financial control is concerned, once the budgets are allocated, it's more advisable to utilize the budget. If HR manager does not utilize the budget, he does not conduct training, he does not recruit more people, more quality resources, this is not a positive thing. He saves money, but this is not a positive thing, right? This is a negative thing, right? So for the execution part, the budget should be utilized, right? But for the planning part, making the budget itself, right, that's a big exercise, because now you do not have any relationship with the outputs. So whenever you plan, whenever you make a budget, how much we should spend on training, how much we should spend on new hirings, how much computers, for example, how much printers we should place in a certain department, how much internet connections we should buy, things like that, right? So these are the things which have to be taken care of very deeply, very insightfully at the time of setting the targets, at the time of budget, right? So the budget is, the plan is now more important, right? So the plan, once the plan is done, then you're not worried about whether the actual expenses, you are not actually attempt to actually save money by not spending the money on the target which have been set, right? This is the theoretical discussion. So the functional excellence and other non-financial objectives. So these are the non-financial quality indicators. For example, for the accounts department, the non-quality, non-financial indicators can be in how much time they produce the financial statements, right? Did they produce the financial statement well in time? For example, did they produce the financial statement with the quality benchmarks produced by the international financial reporting standards? For the HR, did they introduce the training and development programs? Did they complete the training and development programs, for example? And certain other things which probably are more subject matter of the management, right, rather than the accounting. So it's less financial controls, it's more non-financial controls. So now one more thing the author mentions here is that these objectives, when taken isolated from the rest of the company, they may be not aligned with the organization objectives. For example, I want functional excellence in my accounts department, and I want state of the art financial reporting, but state of the art financial reporting is not adding value, right? So not adding value means it is not valued by our customers. It's not going to give us any incentive for profits or sales or revenues or whatever our corporate objectives are. This means that we should bother about the excellence up to a certain extent, but not the ideal, right? So because going to ideal will incur cost, but no benefits, no value. So this means everything which is perfect is not good, right? Because the perfection needs the cost, need the expense. So the expense or cost which is not bringing in any value, that should be discouraged. So here the point is that the functional manager will always be trying, the HR manager, the accounts manager will always be trying to go towards the excellence, but it's the top management function to actually infuse some bounds. So the incremental budgeting and zero-based budgeting are actually relevant here, right? So the budgeting that is usually done, that we need this much amount of raw material, this much amount of labor, this much amount of variable expenses. So so these are actually relevant for the engineered cost centers, right? So here most of the expenses are not variable; they are fixed but discretionary, right? So they can be set on incremental basis, right? Okay, last month we have this budget, last year we have this budget, right? So the current level of expenses is taken as a starting point. So current month means the last period, the just period just expired, has this much amount of expense. So we now adjust for the inflation, we now adjust for more revenues or more legal requirements. So there is a very important, very interesting Parkinson's second law. You just go and Google it and see. It's very interesting law, right? Which says that once the revenues increases, right, the expenses are practically bound to increase whether they are fixed or variable, right? So although by theory, by definition, increase in revenue should not increase our fixed cost, but you will see that as the revenue increases, the accounts department expenses the fixed expenses will also increase. This is the practical inclination of the people, that when the company is growing, the revenues are increasing. So every manager will be trying for more functional excellence, right? So you'll be demanding more budget, and this is the Parkinson's second law. And practically, mostly this is done. So zero-based budgeting is something that you do not take the last benchmark, last month's performance, last budget as your starting point. Rather, you justify, for example, the accounts department sees that it has 23 resources and it needs 2 more resources, it needs 3 more computers. And you say, okay, why you need 23 people? Forget about the 2 people that you want more. Why you need 23 people, right? So justify your workload, justify how much hours of work you have, what kind of resources you need for that, and build your case from the scratch, right? So this is usually, of course, not possible every year. Every department cannot do it. So usually, if it is a case, is on a rolling schedule, on a rolling basis. That this year we do zero-based budgeting for the HR. So it's also a process re-engineering exercise, right? So you justify everything right from the scratch. So this is not only an accounting thing; it's a management thing. So you can benchmark internally or you can benchmark externally. Externally means you say, okay, see the accounts department of, for example, ICI, they have this much amount of revenues, this much amount of total workload to be taken care of, and they have 7 people in their department, for example. So why you cannot survive with 7, right? So this is external benchmarking. They have this much amount of resources, they have this kind of software expenses, technology expenses, so we should have similar. Or internal benchmarking, if within your company there is a good department. For example, there are in ICI, there's a pharmaceutical division, there is a paint division. Every division has, say for example, its own accounts department. The one which is consuming the least amount of resources, we can benchmark with it. And of course, this is just a very broad level, a bird eye view level discussion, because eventually we have more insights that even with the internal benchmarking or external benchmarking, the requirement of the organization may be different from the requirement of that particular business unit or that particular organization. Of course, zero-based budgeting is time consuming and it is usually unwelcome by managers. So practically it is very seldom it is the case that zero-based budgeting is done, but it is done when the company is actually growing. Not growing, it's actually coming down. The performance of the company, the sales are reducing, the company is losing the market share, the company is losing the revenues year by year. Then the management actually has a motivation, as an incentive to reassess each and every expense. Why we need a certain department, for example? Why we need advertising department, marketing department separately? Why marketing and sales are separate? Why not club them together to save expenses? Why we have so much resources in accounts departments? So firing and things like that, downsizing. So these are the things which are sort of zero-based budgeting, a reflection of sort of a zero-based budgeting. And if the company is not in that phase, then usually it's a constant proportion of the organization's revenues. So this is again the Parkinson's law, that if the revenues are 2 million, accounts department will get the budget of 20, for example, 0.2 million. If the organization's revenues are 3 million, it has rise by 50%. So we will give some rise, say 40%, 50% rise to the budget of these discretionary expense department, cost centers. So for discretionary expense centers, the budgets are not performance evaluation tools. As the conclusion, that budgets, rather meeting the budget, rather doing more expenses according to the budgets, right? Doing expenses, spending the money according to the budget is more advisable. Financial performance report is not a means of evaluating the efficiency of the manager. It is unwise to reward executives who spend less than the budget amount, right? And control or discretionary often exercised through non-financial performance measures like user satisfaction and the amount of time it took to finalize the financial reports, etc., etc. So that's it. That ends the discussion of the cost centers and revenue centers. In the next video, we shall see the profits videos to come, the profit centers and the investment centers. Thank you.